You just mentioned that the AstraZeneca Oxford University Serum Institute vaccine has higher efficacy when the gap between the first dose and the second dose is 3 months. How does it then compare? If the gap, when it's 28 days, the efficacy is 70.2%, when the gap is 3 months, in the trials that you've been conducting, what is the efficacy that you're picking up, and when will these trials be made public and peer reviewed?
So one of those, well, we have many groups in the trial that we have undertaken in the UK, in Brazil and in South Africa. And in some of those groups, as we have reported, you can see efficacy as high as 90%. With other regimens, it may be more like 80% with the 3-month interval. And as you say, these data are still being acquired because the more groups you have in a trial, the smaller the numbers you have per group have to be. But, you know, we're not particularly concerned about whether it's 80% or 90% or 95%. What we're primarily trying to do here is to end the pandemic, stop people dying, and those are endpoints for which the vaccine does look very effective, particularly against severe disease. And of course, there was an attempt some months ago by WHO and others to have head-to-head comparisons of these vaccines. That proved to be very difficult. It has not happened yet. So I think we have to accept that these vaccines are all pretty highly efficacious and very useful to deploy, and that to compare them head-to-head now would be very difficult because we're deploying the vaccines and that's the top priority.
So let's take an efficacy of 80%. Explain to common viewers what that means. Does that mean that 80% of those who administered the vaccine will then not have to worry about COVID? They won't get COVID for how long? And what does it mean for the other 20% who are not part of the 80% that get covered? Does it mean that they are likely to get COVID-19? And how severe could their bout of infection possibly be?
Yeah, very good question. What it means is that any individual who is vaccinated with that immunization schedule has an 80% reduction in risk of getting a COVID illness. Whether that's mild or severe, they're all counted in that figure. So some people will get an illness, but what they're very unlikely to get is severe COVID and hospitalization, and certainly massively reduced risk of dying from COVID is what we're seeing in the data on the numbers so far. So I think that can be reassuring. It may well be that people who are vaccinated still get a mild COVID infection, but they're very unlikely indeed, much less than a 20% risk of getting severe COVID or ending up in hospital from that virus.
I spoke to the Director General of the Indian Council for Medical Research. He says that the data before the Indian government is for dose 1 and 2 to be administered at a gap of 28 days, and that's what they will do initially. You're saying that the vaccine is most efficacious at a gap of 3 months, and I'm wondering if you're the ones who created the vaccine and you're telling us that it's best to take it 3 months later. Why are we taking it at a gap of 28 days? What is the data that you have which the Indian government doesn't have at this moment, and would you urge the Indian government then to administer the vaccine in a 3-month period? How do you wrap your head around this?
Yeah, it's not very complicated. Both the UK regulators and now the Indian regulators have said that the vaccine can be given at 4 weeks, 8 weeks or 12 weeks as the interval between vaccination. So the Indian government has not prescribed exactly that interval. It is, we think, somewhat better with a longer interval. It's still very useful indeed with a short interval of 4 weeks. And indeed, with a single dose, without giving the second dose at all, the efficacy is 73%. So you can see we're discussing small differences, 73% versus 80% here. The most important thing by far is not to get too tied up in what exactly the efficacy is of different vaccines, as they all work very well, and to be able to deploy these rapidly, because that's what we need to do. We need to reduce the transmission of this virus to prevent illness and end this pandemic. So the challenge now is deployment of these vaccines.